Hello, my name is Riley Everett, and this is my Weathers Honors Project on Air France Flight 447. Air France Flight 447 crashed on June 1st, 2009. It was an Airbus 330 with almost 19,000 hours. It crashed in the Atlantic coast off Sao Pedro, and it killed all 228 crew members and passengers on board. And it was headed from Rio to Paris. And as you can see in the picture, the crash was right off the coast of Northeast South America. So, in order to fully understand, grasp the situation of what happened in the airplane and what went wrong, we need to look at the black box. And actually, the black box was not found till 2 years after the crash. Um, there was some remnants found of the plane a couple days after it crashed, but the actual black box and the rest of the plane was not found till 2 years later. So, around 1:30, Air France 447 entered a thunderstorm, and they did not plan to deviate around it, likely because they were headed into the intertropical convergence zone, where there's typically quite a few storms, but they did not understand the severity that this storm was going the severe conditions that this storm was producing and turning into, and it ended up being a squall line as they began to pass through it. They had received some PIREPs from pilots that were about 20 to 30 minutes ahead of them, and they were only saying they were encountering moderate turbulence and light rain. At about 1:50, they entered severe icing conditions in this thunderstorm area. So about 20 to 30 minutes after when they were in like the main part of the storm. And at around 2 o'clock, the captain ends up leaving the cockpit and he doesn't specify who's in charge or what roles the other pilots are playing. And the less experienced pilot ends up designating himself as the temporary captain. The captain then left without any specific instructions on the intertropical convergence zone. He didn't make any judgments about the meteorological conditions of the area. And then one of the pilots actually mentioned uh, that it may be like smart to fly given their conditions. And he didn't even really acknowledge it, which is not very leader-like. As he is supposed to be. At about 2:05, they began to understand the severity of the thunderstorm without the captain. They actually began to make a turn. They inputted into autopilot to start turning and try to leave this thunderstorm area, whatever they could, but they were right in the middle of it, and it was way too late to be doing that at this point. Um, At 2:10, the autopilot disengages. Um, when this happens, I should note too, the autopilot did not disengage because the pilots did it. It disengaged manually, which usually means something's wrong. When this happens, the pilot flying is supposed to regain manual control of the airplane, while the pilot not flying monitors the flight path and ensures correct control, essentially. And these first 10 seconds of the autopilot disconnection, the pilots are also supposed to realize that the airspeed indicators have been iced because of the specific loss of airspeed information. But they did not realize that. Um, when the autopilot disconnected, instead, one pilot did take the flight controls, um, but by the cockpit voice recorder, they were obviously surprised and not exactly sure what was happening. Um, Pilots are also trained to make a plan of action before applying anything, any kind of inputs to the plane. And with them having no plan of action, their outcome almost becomes random and there's no sense of anticipation for an outcome. And this is a main reason why we use the decided model today. detect, estimate, choose, identify, decide, evaluate. The pilot flying, then whenever he took the flight controls after the autopilot disconnected, he applied excessive nose up altitude inputs, which are obviously pretty dangerous. And he didn't really verbalize that he was doing this either. The FAA notes that he may have applied these because he realized whenever the autopilot disconnected, uh, the nose went down and about 300 feet were lost in altitude. So it may have just been like just a reaction to get back to that altitude, but he obviously put way too much into it. And almost like a jerk to the controls, which was not safe. At this point, just a few seconds later, the stall horn begins to sound, but it's practically ignored. The nose up at altitude is what triggered this, and the pilot not flying actually asked what it was that like sounded in the cockpit. And they figured it was irrelevant because they thought if they were pitching up, how are they stalling? But that's exactly what we're taught in basic pilot training. But it could be that maybe they were only thinking about a slow speed stall. They were getting indications that the airspeed was almost oversped, but this is obviously because the pitot tube has been iced, which is going to show inconsistent and incorrect speeds. So the pilot flying begins putting up a nose up altitude even more, this time beyond 10 degrees, which is unsafe in an Airbus 330. The pilot not flying suggests reducing pitch to lose altitude, and the pilot flying agrees to lose altitude but continues to pitch up. Uh, he then reduced the thrust because this is when he realized he thinks he's overspeeding the plane. And the pilot not flying realizes that like his airspeeds are probably incorrect, and so he puts the uh, the display on a different type of setting in an attempt to provide the pilot flying with valid information. This information is still bad, and the pilot not flying, his main task basically just says the FAA describes the pilot not flying doing everything he can to get the captain back in the cockpit. Um, at the time, the C chord warning was also going off with the stall horn or the stall warning. And so this is just making like a very stressful and overwhelming oral environment. There's a lot going on. And they could easily turn off the C chord warning. The C chord warning is just telling them that they're 200 feet off their altitude that's selected. And from the point that the autopilot disconnected to this point now that I'm describing was roughly just about 40 seconds. Um, so not much time has passed, and you can see the panic that's going on inside of this airplane when really nothing's necessarily wrong. It's just the pitot tube's been iced. At 210, the stall warning goes off again as angle of attack is increased to 16 degrees by the pilot, where the plane reached 38,000 feet. They started at 35,000 feet and now they're up to 38,000 feet. The aural stall warning is going off with the appearance. They can now see the red and black strip on the speed tape and they're feeling a buffet. This should obviously be a sign that the airplane is stalling. The stall warning is obviously unbelievably loud. And these principles are obviously taught in basic pilot training. The pilot flying may have thought the buffet was due to high speed and the reduced speed. It's just things don't line up whenever uh, it's just like the pilot lost complete his instincts of basic pilot training. At 212, the captain finally re-enters as the angle of attack exceeds 40 degrees at this point, and the VSI was negative 10,000 feet per minute. Um, the stall horn eventually just stops sounding. It almost gives up because the system was so out of sorts that the stall horn didn't know what to do almost. And the pilots, since an Airbus is fly-by-wire, um, and you can also in the cockpit, the FAA describes the A330. It's hard to see what the other pilot is doing with the controls. The pilots don't realize that the pilot who has been flying is holding back on the stick this entire time. The captain at this point, when he finally realizes, yells at him to stop. And as he does, all of the pilots just realize it's too late. And they know they're going to crash. And literally in the last few seconds of the recording, they're still panicking and they just admit like what's going on. Like we're going to crash, but we never even figured out what's going on. If we look at the graphical analysis before the flight, what the pilot saw was probably the skew T. They may have looked at the skew T diagram, or whatever they looked at. Looking at this, there shows potential hazards, but nothing like too bad off of where they were going to be flying at. However, what they were looking at here potentially was also over an hour off the coast that they were going to be, where they were going to be flying into that storm. And like I said earlier, they probably got a lot of information from those PIRAPs thinking it wouldn't be that bad. Um, these, though, are the meteorological conditions they run into 2 hours after departure, um, that never end up leaving. There was obviously enormous cumulonimbus and towering cumulonimbus clouds, which obstructed visibility to the surface, plus the ongoing effect. They were flying at night, and it was a moonless night. And they were flying over the ocean, so it's extremely hard to tell where the ground is at, where you are at in relation to the horizon. The thunderstorm obviously came with strong up and down drafts. There was obviously a ton of strong wind, intense turbulence, and high intensity freezing. And the intertropical convergence zone. This is where the squall line was produced, and it was uh, 800 kilometers wide and 200 kilometers deep. So the present weather conditions, obviously we kind of talked about them already, but obviously there was a thunderstorm, Air France 447, likely never left the squall line. We're not for sure about that. But it's likely that they never left the squall line. And this thunderstorm was the overall like beginning cause to the accident because of the icing it brought. So the thunderstorm brings intensive icing at flight level 350. And this icing was so hard, so severe that the electrical heat at this point couldn't help it. At this point in time, pitot tubes were not good enough to deal with this kind of icing. And there could have been potentially severe precipitation, which also adds to that type of panic. So there could have been hail we may not fully know about. There's no confirmation on that. And that would also affect the pressure sensors potentially. It also, if the wings were experiencing icing, this would have decreased lift by potentially 40% and increased drag by 30%. So these weather conditions were the overall beginning of why Air France 447 crashed. Now we'll look at the causes of the accident. So the first one obviously being the pitot blockage because of the thunderstorm. There was the temporary inconsistency between the airspeed measurements, likely because of the pitot tubes by the ice crystals. Um, that caused the autopilot disconnection and caused the plane to go to reconfigure into alternate law, which is basically saying the pilots had to take over and the way they were flying, the systems. are more simple than autopilot would be, simply put. Next would be pilot control inputs. We know that the pilot was putting way too much attitude up, and this simply destabilized the flight path. There was a lack of communication. There was no link between the crew, that there was a loss of the airspeeds, and they began, because the airspeeds were lost, they began to just not trust any of their instruments. And they didn't call out any appropriate procedures or talk about their plan of action in the cockpit like we should be. Um, then the inattentiveness, the pilot not flying should be watching the pilot fly, the pilot who is flying, their controls into the plane and the deviation of the flight path. And he was not vocalizing enough to the pilot flying about what the correction should be, or determining what steps to take to solve the issue. Then there was a lack of response. The crew did not identify the approach to stall. The aural warnings are going off stall, 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 and their lack of immediate response um, simply made the plane exit from the flight envelope, leading to the crash. And then incorrect judgment. One, they didn't identify, like, they were in alert to the stall warning, but then again, there should have been other things that alerted them. The buffet, the airspeeds, they should have seen that the ice crystals were blocking the pitot tubes. And simply put, they just were not prepared for the situation. Um, the lack of inputs, um, given their situation, made it almost impossible to recover from it at uh, the ending point. The BEA, which is the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, this is essentially just the FAA, but in France. They essentially what they said was that the pilots are trained to regularly handle the stalls, but these pilots did not handle the stall like they would appropriately in training. The pilots never figured out what was happening, even till the last moment. One of the pilots quotedly said before crashing, yep, we're gonna crash, but what's happening? What's going on? Um, and there's more to look at other than the crew's mistakes, because other crews would have done the same action likely, um, because of the training at the time may not have fully prepared these pilots what to do when their airspeed indications go wrong. They freaked out more than they should, and they essentially, whatever inputs they put in at that point is what got them killed. So there's being changes being made to the systems in training is what they put out. After the French BEA came out in 2012, and the FAA also released a report, there's obviously a bunch of different changes made, and these all kind of follow the same theme, which is pitot tubes, the roles of co-pilots, and updates to crew training. The FAA notes that there's going to be more advanced theoretical training. So they're going to be using upset recovery training aids in centers and with all of their operators. There's going to be more realistic exercises on simulators based on specific scenarios. And they're going to be practicing in this startle factor. So they're going to simulate uh, pilots' emotions in the startle factor. What they say the pilots in Air France 447 experienced was the startle factor. They're also taking into account the disengagement of automatic systems. So they're going, at the time, they said they're going to be looking into um, the autopilot disconnecting from the loss of airspeed information. And then they also said there's going to be continuous training at each career stage, whether that's when you're first hired, you get a new type rating, you're upgraded to a captain, or it's just annual recurrent training. There's going to be more stall uh, theoretical training. And then they're going to be reinforcing the application of effective CORM by the crew. So, like we talked about earlier, putting in the decide model to effectively analyze what's going wrong in the plane. And then the last thing is uh, whenever the captain left the cockpit, he never designated who was going to be flying the airplane, who wasn't going to be flying the airplane. So they were just reinforcing the fact that the relief co-pilot is designated by the captain, who sits on the left side and is the pilot not flying. And yeah, there was also I mentioned the pitot tubes, but what they did specifically to the pitot tubes was allowing them not to ice over uh, in conditions. They were just less susceptible to icing conditions. And that's all I have. These are all of the sources I used. The FAA report and the report by the BEA were my main two sources. And then if you'd like more information, there's a good video that I've linked at the bottom, which kind of goes through the cockpit voice recording and the final moments in the Air France Flight 447 crash. Thank you for listening to my honors weather project.